Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly, drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The crowd in the dusty town square of Esperanza Falls watched with barely concealed amusement as Marguerite Dubois stumbled off the stagecoach, her worn traveling dress hanging loose on her thin frame, while the driver unceremoniously dumped her meager belongings onto the ground beside her like unwanted cargo that had finally reached its destination. 3 potential husbands had been waiting for her arrival, but each man took one look at her plain face, hollow cheeks, and desperate eyes before making polite excuses and walking away as if she carried some contagious disease that might infect them with her obvious poverty and social failure that branded her as undesirable in a territory where even the most desperate men could afford to be selective about feminine companionship. The whispers that followed her faltering steps toward the boarding house were loud enough for everyone to hear, as frontier wives and saloon girls alike found common ground in their mockery of the woman who had traveled 2,000 miles only to be rejected by men whose own prospects were so limited that mail-order correspondence had seemed like their best option for finding wives willing to endure territorial hardships in exchange for security and respectability that honest marriage could provide. The children who pointed and giggled were quickly hushed by mothers whose own memories of desperate circumstances made them uncomfortable with such cruel entertainment. But their disapproval did nothing to ease the burning shame that colored Marguerite's pale cheeks as she realized that her carefully hoarded savings had brought her to a place where she was unwanted, even by men who advertised for companionship. The boarding house proprietor, Mrs. Henderson, accepted her money with barely disguised reluctance, while explaining that rooms were typically reserved for respectable travelers rather than women whose circumstances suggested questionable background and uncertain prospects for legitimate employment in communities where reputation was everything, and single women without family connections were automatically suspect regardless of their actual character or moral standing. The room that was provided was barely large enough for a narrow bed and washstand, while the price demanded nearly half of Marguerite's remaining funds, despite accommodations that would have been considered inadequate for servants in any civilized household, where basic human dignity was respected rather than purchased through social position. The meal that was served in the boarding house dining room consisted of thin soup and stale bread that reflected both her reduced circumstances and the proprietor's assessment of what charity she deserved as someone whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed by community members who had already decided that her failure to secure immediate marriage marked her as somehow defective or dangerous in ways that careful observation might eventually reveal. The other diners avoided eye contact while discussing her situation as if she weren't present. Their conversations revealing assumptions about her background and character that transformed desperate circumstances into moral failings worthy of social exclusion and systematic humiliation that frontier communities sometimes imposed on outsiders whose integration threatened established hierarchies. When gunshots erupted in the street outside and excited voices announced that Jacques Moreau, the territory's most feared gunslinger, had arrived to settle accounts with someone who had cheated him at cards, Marguerite's hand instinctively moved to the hidden holster beneath her traveling dress, her fingers finding familiar comfort in smooth leather and cold steel, while her pulse quickened with recognition that her carefully constructed facade of helpless femininity was about to be tested by circumstances that would either preserve her desperate disguise or reveal capabilities that no mail-order bride was supposed to possess in territories where women's strength was measured by their ability to endure suffering rather than prevent it through superior firepower and tactical skill that only years of survival in hostile environments could provide. 6 months earlier, Marguerite's decision to answer mail-order bride advertisements had been motivated by circumstances that made any alternative to starvation seem preferable to continued existence in Chicago. Tenements where women without family protection faced choices between factory work that destroyed health through dangerous conditions and wages that barely covered rent, or employment in establishments where respectability was sacrificed for survival in ways that left permanent stains on both reputation and soul. The death of her father in industrial accident had eliminated her only source of protection and financial support, while creditors who had extended generous terms to employed railroad worker became ruthless in their demands when his daughter inherited debts that exceeded anything her limited earning potential could address through conventional employment available to women whose education had prepared them for domestic roles rather than independent survival. The letters that she had written to prospective husbands were carefully crafted to emphasize domestic skills and moral character, while concealing both her desperate financial circumstances and the specialized knowledge that her father's military service had provided through training that was considered inappropriate for feminine development, but which had been shared during long winter evenings when survival skills seemed more important than social conventions that assumed women would always have masculine protection available when circumstances required capabilities that drawing room education couldn't provide. Her penmanship and vocabulary had impressed correspondents whose own educational backgrounds were limited by frontier circumstances, while her enthusiasm for Western adventure disguised calculation rather than romantic idealism about territorial marriage. The photographs that she had sent were truthful, but carefully selected to emphasize her best features while minimizing physical evidence of malnutrition and stress that poverty had carved into her appearance over months of inadequate food and constant worry about survival in urban environment that treated women like disposable commodities whose value diminished rapidly when youth and health were compromised by circumstances beyond their control. The responses that she received were encouraging enough to justify spending precious savings on travel expenses that represented enormous gamble with resources that could have sustained her for several additional months in Chicago while seeking alternative solutions to financial crisis that seemed to offer no viable options for independent survival. The journey westward had provided time for reflection and preparation that included practice with weapons handling and tactical thinking that her father's training had emphasized as essential skills for survival in environments where law enforcement was distant and personal protection depended on individual capability rather than social institutions that civilized society provided for citizen safety. The other passengers had assumed that her nervousness during travel was natural feminine anxiety about frontier marriage rather than professional assessment of security risks and tactical vulnerabilities that military training had taught her to evaluate automatically whenever entering unfamiliar territory where potential threats might require immediate response. The discovery that her carefully planned correspondence had failed to secure immediate marriage created emotional and financial crisis that threatened to leave her stranded in territory where opportunities for feminine employment were even more limited than urban alternatives. While her rapidly diminishing resources made return to Chicago impossible and alternative destinations equally unrealistic for someone whose prospects seemed to deteriorate with each rejection that emphasized her inadequacy according to standards that measured women's worth through physical attractiveness and social connections rather than character and capability that frontier survival actually required for successful adaptation to territorial life. The military training that had shaped Marguerite's childhood was provided by Colonel Pierre Dubois, whose service with Union cavalry during the war between the states had included specialized operations behind enemy lines, where survival depended on skills that conventional military education didn't provide, without extensive experience in hostile territory, where capture meant death and success required capabilities that exceeded normal soldierly training through individual initiative and tactical innovation, that desperate circumstances had developed into specialized expertise. His decision to educate his daughter in weapons handling and tactical thinking had been motivated by recognition that frontier life made such knowledge essential for any woman who might find herself without masculine protection in environments where survival depended on personal capability rather than social conventions. The lessons that had been disguised as games during her youth included marksmanship training with various weapons, tactical movement and concealment techniques, and psychological preparation for violence that emphasized decision-making under pressure and systematic evaluation of threats that could be neutralized through superior positioning and timing, rather than simple courage that might prove inadequate when facing opponents whose experience exceeded civilian backgrounds. Her father's emphasis on mental preparation and emotional control during dangerous situations had included philosophical discussions about justice and moral responsibility that emphasized protection of innocent people as primary motivation for developing combat capabilities that should never be used for personal advantage. The death that had claimed Colonel Dubois was caused by industrial accident that resulted from safety violations and corporate negligence that legal system couldn't address adequately due to political corruption and economic influence that protected profitable enterprises from accountability for worker safety and environmental responsibility that civilized society demanded from businesses whose operations affected community welfare. His final instructions to his daughter had emphasized the importance of concealing her military training from people whose social prejudices would make such knowledge dangerous for women whose survival might depend on being underestimated by enemies who assumed feminine helplessness rather than tactical competence that could provide decisive advantages in dangerous situations. The financial crisis that had followed his death was intensified by medical expenses and funeral costs that had consumed savings accumulated through years of careful frugality. While pension benefits that should have provided temporary support were delayed by bureaucratic complications that seemed designed to discourage claims from families whose resources couldn't sustain extended legal battles with federal agencies whose efficiency was compromised by political appointment rather than professional competence. The factory work that had been available to women in her circumstances provided wages that covered basic survival needs, but which couldn't address inherited debts or accumulate resources necessary for independent establishment of household that might provide security and respectability. The decision to seek Western marriage had been motivated by realistic assessment of alternatives rather than romantic fantasy about frontier adventure, while her calculation that territorial circumstances might provide better opportunities for someone whose capabilities exceeded conventional feminine limitations was based on understanding that Western communities valued practical skills and personal competence more highly than social connections and fashionable appearance that urban society emphasized as measures of feminine worth. Her preparation for Western travel had included careful consideration of equipment and supplies that might be necessary for survival in hostile environment, where conventional support systems weren't available for women whose safety depended on individual capability rather than social protection. The first rejection that had crushed her hopes in Esperanza Falls came from Thomas Wellington, a successful merchant whose correspondence had suggested appreciation for intelligent conversation and domestic partnership, but whose obvious disappointment upon seeing her appearance revealed that physical attraction was more important than intellectual compatibility or moral character that his letters had emphasized as primary requirements for successful frontier marriage. His polite but decisive withdrawal from their arrangement was accomplished with efficiency that suggested previous experience with similar disappointments, while his immediate departure from the stagecoach depot demonstrated determination to avoid social embarrassment. That association with rejected mail-order bride might create within community where reputation and social standing were essential for business success. The second man who had expressed interest was Claude Berthier, a rancher whose isolated property required domestic assistance that marriage could provide more economically than hired help. but whose assessment of her physical condition suggested concerns about her ability to endure harsh frontier labor that ranching operations required from women whose contributions were measured by practical capability rather than ornamental value that civilized society provided for feminine development. His questions about her health and family background revealed calculating approach to marriage that emphasized economic partnership rather than romantic attachment, while her obvious malnutrition and urban background made her unsuitable for agricultural work that required strength and experience that city life couldn't provide. The third rejection was perhaps most painful because Henri Gautier's initial enthusiasm had created genuine hope that her desperate gamble might succeed despite her disadvantages, while his gradual recognition of her circumstances and apparent reassessment of her suitability was accomplished through conversation that revealed his own desperation for companionship, while also demonstrating that even lonely men had standards that her appearance and obvious poverty couldn't meet. His eventual decision to postpone their arrangement pending further consideration was a diplomatic way of avoiding direct rejection, while making clear that her prospects for marriage were non-existent unless circumstances changed dramatically. The humiliation that was created by systematic rejection in public setting, where entire community could observe her failure, was intensified by recognition that her carefully saved resources were nearly exhausted, and alternatives for survival in territorial environment were extremely limited for women whose backgrounds didn't include family connections or specialized skills that frontier communities valued enough to support through employment opportunities. The boarding house accommodation that represented temporary shelter was consuming her remaining funds at rate that made extended residence impossible without immediate income that her circumstances made unlikely to obtain through conventional feminine employment. The desperation that was growing with each passing hour was balanced by determination that had sustained her through previous crises, while her father's training had emphasized that defeat was often temporary condition that could be reversed through tactical patience and systematic exploitation of opportunities that desperate circumstances sometimes provided for people whose capabilities exceeded what their opponents expected from apparently helpless victims. When sounds of approaching confrontation reached the boarding house, her professional instincts recognized opportunity that might provide solution to immediate crisis if she possessed courage to abandon disguise that had failed to provide security and reveal capabilities that frontier survival might require regardless of social consequences that honest demonstration of competence could create. Jacques Moreau's reputation preceded him into Esperanza Falls like thunder announcing approaching storm, while his arrival created immediate tension that transformed normal frontier business into suspended animation, as shopkeepers closed their doors and citizens sought cover behind anything that might provide protection from violence that his presence inevitably brought to communities where his services were either desperately needed or fatally unwanted. The man himself was everything legends had described: tall, lean, and dangerous in ways that went beyond simple marksmanship into territory involving psychological intimidation and tactical sophistication that had kept him alive through countless confrontations where lesser gunfighters had found permanent rest in frontier graveyards that marked the limits of their courage and capability. The challenge that had brought him to Esperanza Falls involved Marcus Thibodeau, a saloon owner whose reputation for cheating at cards was matched only by his skill at avoiding consequences through bribes and intimidation that had protected him from local justice, while his systematic theft continued to prey on travelers whose losses were dismissed by territorial authorities, whose effectiveness was limited by political corruption and economic influence, that purchased protection for profitable enterprises regardless of their impact on community welfare and honest business competition. Moreau's arrival meant that unofficial justice was finally coming for someone whose crimes had exceeded community tolerance without triggering adequate legal response. The confrontation that was building in the town square had attracted spectators whose morbid curiosity overcame natural caution about being present when professional gunfighter demonstrated capabilities that had made his services legendary throughout southwestern territories, where conventional law enforcement was inadequate for addressing systematic criminal activity that threatened community safety and economic development. The positioning that various townspeople had chosen revealed their assessment of likely trajectory of gunfire and potential for collateral damage that made viewing positions both strategically sound and morally questionable for people whose entertainment was derived from others' mortal danger. The terms that were being negotiated through intermediaries involved satisfaction of honor and financial restitution that Thibodeau's cheating had created, while his obvious reluctance to face legendary gunfighter in direct confrontation was generating community pressure for resolution that would either restore his reputation through successful defense against professional killer or eliminate his continued presence through defeat, that justice demanded for systematic criminal activity that legal institutions had failed to address through conventional prosecution and punishment. The odds that were being calculated by observers favored Moreau's victory so heavily that alternative outcomes seemed impossible despite occasional surprises that frontier violence sometimes provided. The moment when Marguerite realized that her desperate circumstances had created opportunity for demonstrating capabilities that might solve immediate financial crisis while also serving community justice that conventional law enforcement couldn't provide, was marked by recognition that her father's training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation where superior tactical thinking and marksmanship could achieve results that social position and conventional feminine roles couldn't accomplish despite their theoretical advantages in civilized society. When she stepped out of the boarding house and began walking toward the confrontation that was developing in the town square, her transformation from rejected mail-order bride to something entirely different was visible in changes in posture and movement that suggested competence and confidence that previous humiliation had concealed beneath facade of helpless femininity. The silence that fell over the town square when Marguerite walked into the space between Moreau and Thibodeau was complete except for the desert wind that stirred dust around her worn boots. While her quiet announcement that she was calling out Jacques Moreau on behalf of frontier justice created shock that transformed morbid entertainment into something approaching religious experience as witnesses struggled to comprehend what they were seeing when apparently helpless woman challenged territory's most feared gunslinger to combat that could only end in her death or his impossible defeat. The laughter that initially greeted her declaration died quickly when observers recognized something in her stance and hand position that suggested capabilities far beyond what her previous humiliation had revealed. The response from Moreau himself was a mixture of amusement and professional curiosity as he attempted to understand what desperation or madness had motivated rejected mail-order bride to issue challenge that would certainly result in her immediate death, while his reputation for never backing down from confrontation made withdrawal from situation impossible, despite his obvious preference for avoiding violence against women whose death would create complications that his professional standing couldn't easily survive. His questions about her background and motivation were designed to provide face-saving exit from situation that had developed beyond anything normal frontier protocol could address through conventional resolution. The crowd that had gathered for expected entertainment between professional gunfighter and dishonest saloon owner was now witnessing something unprecedented in territorial history, while their initial shock was gradually replaced by growing tension as they recognized that Marguerite's challenge had been issued with calm determination that suggested either complete insanity or confidence, based on capabilities that her previous humiliation had successfully concealed from community observation. The positioning that various spectators chose revealed their assessment of changing tactical situation, while also demonstrating respect for marksmanship demonstration that was about to either vindicate or eliminate women whose courage exceeded anything frontier experience had previously provided. The explanation that Marguerite provided for her challenge included statement that Moreau's reputation was built on intimidation of honest people rather than legitimate skill at arms, while her systematic enumeration of tactical advantages that defensive positioning could provide against aggressive gunfighter revealed knowledge that exceeded casual observation into territory involving professional military training that no woman was supposed to possess according to social conventions that governed frontier gender roles. Her analysis of his previous victories included details that suggested access to intelligence that only law enforcement or military sources could have provided through systematic investigation of his methods and capabilities. The moment when Moreau realized that his opponent possessed knowledge and confidence that represented genuine threat rather than feminine delusion was marked by subtle changes in his own positioning and tactical assessment, while his recognition that retreat was impossible due to reputation and community expectations created situation where professional pride and survival instinct were forcing confrontation that could challenge everything he had built through years of systematic intimidation and carefully chosen battles against opponents whose defeat was assured through superior training and psychological warfare that helpless woman shouldn't have been able to counter through tactical sophistication that exceeded his own experience with frontier violence. The tension that preceded actual gunfire was measured in heartbeats that seemed to stretch into eternity, while both combatants evaluated tactical advantages and psychological factors that would determine outcome of confrontation that had exceeded everyone's expectations through development from simple challenge into test of capabilities that represented everything both participants had built their identities around throughout lives dedicated to survival through superior combat skills. Marguerite's breathing remained controlled and steady, despite recognition that failure would mean immediate death, while her father's training in psychological preparation for combat was enabling emotional detachment that professional soldiers required for making life-and-death decisions without hesitation that could prove fatal when facing experienced opponents. The crowd that surrounded them had grown silent with anticipation that exceeded normal frontier entertainment, through recognition that they were witnessing historical moment when established order might be challenged by someone whose appearance had suggested helplessness, while concealing capabilities that could redefine community understanding of feminine potential and individual courage that desperate circumstances sometimes revealed in people whose true character had been hidden beneath social expectations and economic necessity. The positioning that spectators had chosen reflected their assessment of likely direction and accuracy of gunfire, while also revealing moral preferences for outcomes that would either confirm traditional beliefs or force reconsideration of assumptions about gender and capability. The signal that initiated actual combat was subtle movement that professional gunfighters recognized as commitment to violence, while both participants' hands moved toward weapons with speed that demonstrated years of practice and training that had been developed through countless hours of preparation for moments when survival depended on split-second timing and accuracy that could not be achieved through casual familiarity with firearms, but which required dedication and systematic development of reflexes that exceeded normal human capabilities through specialized training and natural talent that rare individuals possessed. The draw that followed challenged every assumption about feminine capability and professional reputation, as Marguerite's movement demonstrated speed and precision that exceeded Moreau's legendary skills through combination of superior training and tactical positioning that her father's military instruction had emphasized as more important than simple quick-draw technique for achieving victory in combat situations where psychological preparation and strategic thinking provided decisive advantages over opponents whose capabilities were limited to mechanical repetition of practiced movements without understanding of underlying principles that governed successful application of violence for legitimate purposes. The shot that ended Jacques Moreau's career was placed with surgical precision that demonstrated marksmanship training far beyond anything civilian experience could provide, while the speed of her draw and accuracy of placement revealed capabilities that had been developed through military instruction and maintained through practice that her circumstances had required despite social prohibitions against feminine involvement in activities that were considered exclusively masculine domains. When Moreau's weapon cleared leather a fraction of a second after her shot had already found its mark, the crowd realized they had witnessed something that would become legend throughout territories where professional gunfighters were measured against standard that rejected mail-order bride had just established through demonstration of superior skill and tactical superiority. The silence that followed Moreau's collapse was profound and complete as witnesses struggled to process what they had seen. While their collective shock was gradually replaced by recognition that everything they thought they knew about the rejected mail-order bride had been illusion created by desperate circumstances rather than actual limitation of capability or character that her previous humiliation had suggested to community members whose social prejudices had prevented accurate assessment of individual worth and potential contribution to frontier society. The medical attention that was immediately provided to Moreau revealed that Marguerite's shot had been placed with precision, designed to disable rather than kill, demonstrating both professional competence and moral restraint that exceeded normal gunfighter behavior. The crowd that had gathered for morbid entertainment was now witnessing resurrection of someone whose true identity had been concealed beneath facade of helplessness, while their gradual recognition of what her capabilities might mean for community safety and justice created foundation for entirely different assessment of her value and potential contribution to territorial development that effective law enforcement could provide when conventional authorities were inadequate for addressing systematic criminal activity that threatened honest business and citizen welfare. The questions that began emerging from spectators revealed curiosity about her background and training that previous social dismissal had prevented anyone from investigating. The response from Thibodeau, whose confrontation with Moreau had been interrupted by unexpected intervention, included immediate attempt to leave town before attention could focus on criminal activities that had motivated professional gunfighters' challenge, while his obvious relief at avoiding potentially fatal confrontation was balanced by recognition that new law enforcement presence might prove even more dangerous to continued criminal operations than Moreau's legendary reputation had represented. His hasty departure from saloon and preparations for immediate travel revealed guilt and fear that Marguerite's demonstration had created through implication that justice might finally be available for systematic criminal activity. The territorial marshal, who arrived in response to reports of gunfight, found situation that exceeded normal frontier violence through implications for law enforcement and community safety that professional competence could provide when properly directed toward legitimate objectives. While his investigation of circumstances revealed background and training that suggested federal rather than civilian origins for capabilities that no mail-order bride should have possessed without specialized instruction and extensive practice that suggested military or law enforcement background that her desperate circumstances had forced her to conceal. The recognition that was gradually emerging from community members included apologies for previous treatment and offers of assistance that reflected both shame about earlier behavior and calculation about advantages that association with professional gunfighter might provide for individual protection and community safety in territory where law enforcement was distant and criminal activity was threatening economic development and social stability that effective resistance could preserve through superior tactical capability and moral commitment to justice that conventional authorities couldn't always provide despite official responsibility for citizen protection. The confession that Marguerite provided to Territorial Marshal Thomas Bradley included admission that her true identity was Lieutenant Marguerite Dubois, whose service with federal law enforcement had been suspended pending investigation of circumstances surrounding her father's death and subsequent financial crisis that had forced her to seek alternative employment, while official channels addressed corruption and criminal negligence that had caused industrial accident and systematic denial of pension benefits that his military service should have guaranteed. Her assignment to territorial duty had been interrupted by personal crisis that had made undercover work impossible, while emotional trauma and financial desperation required immediate attention through whatever means survival demanded. The documentation that she produced from hidden compartment in her travel trunk included federal credentials and official correspondence that confirmed her law enforcement status, while also revealing scope of investigation that had brought her to territorial Arizona on assignment that was designed to address systematic criminal activity and political corruption that exceeded local authority for effective intervention and required federal resources and specialized training for successful completion of mission that conventional territorial law enforcement couldn't accomplish through normal procedures. Her mail-order bride correspondence had been cover story designed to provide legitimate reason for presence in territory while official investigation proceeded. The mission that had been assigned through federal channels involved investigating mining company operations and territorial political corruption that was threatening federal authority and constitutional government throughout southwestern regions where organized crime was challenging democratic institutions through systematic violence and purchased influence that exceeded normal business competition into territory involving criminal conspiracy and systematic oppression of civilian populations whose rights were supposedly protected by territorial governance and federal oversight that corruption was systematically undermining through bribery and intimidation. The personal crisis that had interrupted professional obligations included father's death and financial difficulties that had been caused by industrial accident and corporate negligence, while bureaucratic delays and legal complications had prevented resolution of inheritance and pension issues that should have provided financial foundation for continued federal service without necessity for desperate measures that personal survival had required when official support systems had failed to address legitimate needs of law enforcement personnel whose family circumstances required immediate attention that agency resources couldn't provide through normal administrative procedures. The decision to continue with mail-order bride cover story, despite changed circumstances, had been motivated by recognition that official investigation required continued presence in territory, while personal financial crisis was being resolved through channels that bureaucratic efficiency couldn't accelerate, despite urgent necessity for income and security that survival demanded when official salary was being delayed by administrative complications that seemed designed to discourage continued federal service, rather than support law enforcement personnel whose dedication exceeded personal convenience and individual welfare for sake of constitutional duty and community protection. The proposal that Marshal Bradley presented included immediate restoration of federal status and official recognition of Marguerite's law enforcement credentials, while her demonstrated capabilities and territorial knowledge made her valuable resource for addressing criminal activities that conventional federal presence couldn't investigate without alerting suspects whose survival depended on maintaining appearance of legitimate business operations while conducting systematic criminal enterprise that threatened territorial development and constitutional government through violence and corruption that exceeded local authority for effective resistance or prevention through normal law enforcement procedures. The assignment that was offered involved continued investigation of mining company operations and territorial corruption, while maintaining residence in Esperanza Falls as base of operations that could provide community protection and systematic intelligence gathering about criminal activities that federal intervention was designed to eliminate through legal prosecution rather than vigilante justice that frontier circumstances sometimes required when constitutional law enforcement was inadequate for addressing immediate threats to citizen safety and territorial governance, that democratic institutions were supposed to provide. The community acceptance that was developing in response to her demonstration of capability and commitment to justice created foundation for legitimate integration into frontier society, whose previous rejection had been based on misconceptions about her character and background, rather than accurate assessment of potential contribution to territorial development and community welfare that effective law enforcement could provide when properly supported by citizen cooperation and official recognition of individual worth, regardless of gender or conventional social expectations that limited feminine participation in activities essential for frontier survival. The resources that were provided through federal authorization included equipment and financial support necessary for establishing permanent residence and law enforcement operations in territory where conventional federal presence would have alerted criminal organizations whose elimination required undercover investigation and tactical capabilities that normal territorial authorities couldn't provide without specialized training and federal backing that her unique combination of qualifications and circumstances made possible through assignment that could serve both personal needs and official objectives. The transformation that was occurring in community perception reflected recognition that capability and moral commitment were more important than social conventions and gender expectations for determining individual worth and potential contribution to territorial development. While her integration into frontier society was creating precedent for feminine participation in law enforcement activities that had been considered exclusively masculine domain, despite obvious need for expanded personnel and diverse capabilities that systematic criminal activity was requiring for successful investigation and prevention through methods that exceeded traditional approaches to territorial governance and citizen protection. The relationships that Marguerite began developing with community leaders included systematic evaluation of trustworthiness and potential cooperation in addressing criminal activities that were threatening territorial development. While her careful assessment of individual character and motivations was enabling identification of reliable allies whose support would be essential for successful completion of federal investigation, without alerting criminal organizations whose survival depended on maintaining appearance of legitimacy while conducting systematic illegal operations that exceeded normal business competition through violence and intimidation that territorial authority couldn't adequately address. The intelligence network that was gradually established through careful cultivation of sources included shopkeepers, ranchers, and ordinary citizens whose daily activities provided opportunities for observing criminal behavior and suspicious activities that systematic investigation required for building legal cases that could result in successful prosecution through federal courts whose jurisdiction and resources exceeded territorial capabilities for addressing organized crime and political corruption that challenged constitutional government and democratic institutions throughout southwestern regions where federal intervention was essential for protecting citizen rights. The cooperation that was developing with local business owners reflected their recognition that effective law enforcement could provide economic benefits through elimination of criminal competition and systematic theft that was threatening legitimate enterprise and community prosperity. While their willingness to share information and provide material support demonstrated understanding that individual success depended on territorial development and constitutional government, that systematic criminal activity was challenging through methods that exceeded normal business competition into territory involving organized assault on democratic institutions and citizen welfare. The resistance that was encountered from certain territorial officials and business interests revealed scope of corruption and criminal infiltration that federal investigation was designed to address. While their attempts to discredit or eliminate new law enforcement presence demonstrated desperation and guilt that confirmed suspicions about systematic criminal conspiracy that exceeded normal territorial governance challenges through coordinated opposition to constitutional authority and federal oversight that democratic institutions required for maintaining legitimate control over frontier populations whose rights were being systematically violated through purchased influence and organized violence. The tactical situation that was developing through community integration and intelligence gathering was creating opportunities for systematic exposure of criminal activities while also establishing foundation for sustained law enforcement presence that could prevent future development of organized crime through continued federal oversight and community cooperation that effective territorial governance required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework that protected rather than exploited frontier populations whose development depended on rule of law rather than criminal control. The evidence that was systematically gathered through careful observation and strategic intelligence collection revealed scope of criminal conspiracy that exceeded anything federal authorities had anticipated, involving coordination between mining companies, territorial officials, and organized criminal enterprises whose activities threatened not only local governance, but also federal authority and constitutional government throughout southwestern territories, where democratic institutions required protection against systematic corruption and violence that exceeded normal territorial challenges through organized assault on citizen rights and territorial development that legitimate business and honest governance were supposed to provide. The financial records that were obtained through covert investigation demonstrated systematic theft and money laundering operations that were funding criminal activities while also providing resources for political corruption that was purchasing protection and official cooperation from territorial authorities whose constitutional obligations were being systematically violated through arrangements that served criminal interests rather than citizen welfare and democratic governance that federal oversight was designed to protect through law enforcement and judicial accountability that corruption was systematically undermining through purchased influence and intimidation. The pattern of violence that was emerging through systematic analysis of criminal activities revealed strategic elimination of witnesses and systematic intimidation of honest business owners whose competition or testimony threatened criminal operations, while the sophistication and coordination of these activities demonstrated organization and resources that exceeded normal territorial criminal activity through systematic planning and professional execution that required federal intervention and specialized law enforcement capabilities for successful investigation and prosecution through constitutional means that democratic institutions provided for addressing domestic threats to legitimate government. The international connections that were discovered through continued investigation revealed foreign involvement in criminal operations that threatened national security as well as territorial governance, while evidence of systematic smuggling and political manipulation suggested criminal conspiracy that exceeded normal territorial jurisdiction into areas requiring federal investigation and international cooperation for successful elimination of threats that challenged American sovereignty and constitutional government throughout regions where territorial development was essential for national expansion and democratic incorporation of frontier populations into constitutional framework. The danger that was increasing as investigation proceeded was evidenced by systematic surveillance and escalating attempts at intimidation that demonstrated criminal awareness of federal investigation, while also revealing desperation and resources that could be deployed for eliminating law enforcement threats to profitable operations. While the personal risks that Marguerite faced were balanced by recognition that successful completion of mission could eliminate systematic criminal activity and political corruption that was threatening not only individual safety but also territorial development and constitutional government throughout southwestern regions where federal protection was essential for democratic institutions. The letter that arrived through federal channels carried news that made Marguerite's federal assignment suddenly personal rather than simply professional, as intelligence reports revealed that her father's death had been caused by criminal sabotage rather than industrial accident, while the mining company whose negligence had been blamed for structural failure, that claimed his life was part of systematic criminal conspiracy, that federal investigation was designed to eliminate through legal prosecution and prevention of future criminal activity, that threatened worker safety and community welfare throughout territories where corporate interests were systematically violating federal law and constitutional protections. The evidence that was provided through official investigation included documentation of systematic safety violations and criminal negligence that had been concealed through political corruption and legal manipulation, while the pattern of similar incidents throughout territorial mining operations revealed organizational structure and criminal methodology that exceeded normal corporate irresponsibility into territory involving systematic murder and criminal conspiracy designed to eliminate obstacles to profitable operations regardless of human cost and constitutional protections that federal law was supposed to provide for worker safety and environmental responsibility. The personal motivation that was added to professional obligation created emotional intensity that threatened to compromise tactical judgment and systematic approach that successful investigation required. While recognition that her father's death was connected to criminal conspiracy that current assignment was designed to eliminate provided additional determination for completing mission despite personal risks and emotional trauma that knowledge of deliberate murder was creating through combination of grief and anger that professional law enforcement training was supposed to control through disciplined response to criminal activity regardless of personal involvement. The tactical implications of personal connection to criminal conspiracy included enhanced motivation for successful completion of investigation, while also creating potential vulnerabilities that criminal organizations might exploit through targeting emotional responses and personal relationships that could be used for intimidation or elimination of federal law enforcement presence that was threatening systematic criminal operations and political corruption throughout territorial regions, where constitutional government required federal protection against organized crime and systematic violence that exceeded local authority for effective resistance. The decision that confronted Marguerite involved maintaining professional objectivity and systematic approach that federal investigation required, while also acknowledging personal stakes that had transformed assignment from routine law enforcement into quest for justice that exceeded official obligations through individual commitment to eliminating criminal organization that had murdered her father while also threatening territorial development and constitutional government, that federal service was designed to protect through legal rather than personal means of achieving justice and accountability. The criminal organization's response to federal investigation included systematic planning for elimination of law enforcement threat through methods that demonstrated sophisticated intelligence gathering and tactical coordination that exceeded normal territorial criminal activity, while their surveillance and assessment of Marguerite's capabilities revealed recognition that conventional intimidation would be inadequate for dealing with federal agent whose competence and determination threatened systematic criminal operations that political corruption had been protecting through purchased influence and organized violence against honest competition and citizen welfare. The ambush that was planned included coordination between multiple criminal elements whose combined resources could overwhelm individual resistance despite superior training and tactical preparation, while their choice of location and timing demonstrated professional assessment of targets' habits and vulnerabilities that extensive observation had revealed through systematic surveillance operations that exceeded normal criminal intelligence gathering through sophisticated coordination and resource allocation that suggested organizational structure and external support that exceeded territorial criminal capabilities. The intelligence that reached Marguerite through her community network included warnings about increased criminal activity and suspicious behavior that suggested immediate threat to her safety and mission completion, while the pattern of preparatory activities revealed criminal planning that exceeded simple elimination attempt into territory, involving systematic assault on federal authority and constitutional government through targeted violence against law enforcement personnel whose testimony and investigation could result in prosecution and conviction for criminal conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions throughout southwestern territories. The countermeasures that were implemented included tactical preparation and community coordination that could provide defensive advantages despite numerical inferiority and resource limitations, while her professional training and territorial knowledge created opportunities for turning criminal aggression into tactical disadvantage through superior positioning and strategic thinking that federal law enforcement education had emphasized as essential for survival in hostile environments where conventional support was unavailable and individual capability determined outcome of life and death confrontations. The moment when systematic surveillance detected immediate threat approaching through coordinated assault from multiple directions created tactical situation that required immediate decision between retreat that would abandon mission and community protection or engagement that could eliminate criminal threat while risking individual survival and federal investigation that constitutional government required for addressing systematic corruption and organized crime that was challenging democratic institutions and territorial development throughout regions where federal authority was essential for protecting citizen rights and legitimate governance. The battle that erupted when criminal forces launched coordinated assault on Marguerite's position exceeded anything normal territorial violence had produced through systematic organization and professional execution, while her defensive response demonstrated capabilities that federal training and personal determination had developed through years of preparation for situations where survival depended on superior tactics and individual competence against numerically superior enemies, whose resources exceeded normal criminal activity through organizational structure and equipment that challenged federal law enforcement through methods that exceeded normal territorial jurisdiction. The tactical situation that developed through initial exchange of gunfire revealed that criminal planning had been comprehensive and professional despite underestimation of targets' capabilities and defensive preparation, while the coordination and equipment that attacking forces demonstrated exceeded normal territorial criminal activity through systematic military-style organization that suggested external support and specialized training that challenged federal authority through methods that exceeded normal criminal resistance into territory, involving organized assault on constitutional government and democratic institutions. The community response that was triggered by sounds of sustained combat included citizen participation in defensive operations that demonstrated loyalty and determination that effective law enforcement and community protection had earned through demonstrated commitment to territorial welfare and constitutional government, while their willingness to risk personal safety for protection of federal law enforcement represented triumph of democratic values over criminal intimidation and systematic oppression that organized crime had been using for controlling territorial development and political governance. The turning point that was achieved through combination of superior tactics and community support created opportunities for eliminating criminal leadership while also capturing evidence that federal prosecution required for systematic elimination of organized crime and political corruption throughout territorial regions. While the coordination between professional law enforcement and citizen cooperation demonstrated effectiveness of democratic institutions, when properly supported by individual courage and community commitment to constitutional government and territorial development that served population welfare rather than criminal interests. The victory that was accomplished through sustained combat and systematic elimination of criminal forces provided foundation for successful completion of federal investigation, while also establishing precedent for citizen cooperation and effective law enforcement that territorial development required for incorporation into American constitutional framework. While the evidence that was captured during operation included documentation of systematic criminal conspiracy and political corruption that federal prosecution could utilize for eliminating remaining threats to democratic institutions and constitutional government throughout southwestern territories. The trials that followed systematic arrests of criminal conspirators established legal precedents for federal prosecution of organized crime and political corruption that threatened territorial governance and constitutional authority. While the evidence that Marguerite's investigation had provided exceeded anything previous federal law enforcement had accomplished through systematic documentation of criminal activities and systematic corruption that had been challenging democratic institutions and citizen rights throughout southwestern territories, where federal intervention had been essential for protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power exceeded local authority. The sentences that were imposed on convicted criminals included death penalties for murder and systematic violence, while life imprisonment was assigned for financial crimes and political corruption that had been threatening territorial development and constitutional government. While the systematic elimination of criminal organization through legal rather than violent means demonstrated effectiveness of democratic institutions when properly supported by professional law enforcement and citizen cooperation that served constitutional values rather than individual advantage or criminal interests that had been systematically exploiting territorial resources and political governance. The recognition that was provided through federal commendation acknowledged Marguerite's professional competence and personal sacrifice that had enabled successful completion of mission that exceeded normal law enforcement achievements through individual courage and systematic investigation that had eliminated threats to constitutional government and democratic institutions, while her integration into territorial society and continued law enforcement service created foundation for sustained federal presence and community protection that territorial development required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework. The personal satisfaction that was achieved through elimination of criminal organization responsible for her father's death provided emotional closure while also serving broader objectives of federal law enforcement and constitutional government that her professional service was designed to protect. While recognition that justice had been achieved through legal rather than personal means demonstrated commitment to democratic values and rule of law that professional law enforcement represented despite personal motivation and emotional involvement that criminal conspiracy had created through systematic violence and deliberate murder. The community transformation that resulted from elimination of criminal influence and establishment of effective law enforcement created foundation for legitimate economic development and social progress that democratic institutions could provide when properly protected against organized crime and systematic corruption. While the precedent that was established through successful federal intervention created framework for future law enforcement operations that could prevent development of similar threats to territorial governance and constitutional authority throughout regions where democratic institutions required federal protection against domestic enemies. The position that was offered to Marguerite as permanent territorial marshal represented federal recognition of her capabilities and community acceptance while providing foundation for continued law enforcement service that territorial development required for maintaining constitutional government and citizen protection against remaining criminal elements whose elimination required systematic vigilance and professional competence that her unique combination of training and local knowledge could provide through continued federal service and community integration that demonstrated effectiveness of democratic institutions when properly supported. The house that was purchased through federal assistance and personal savings provided foundation for permanent residence and community integration that effective law enforcement required for maintaining citizen cooperation and systematic intelligence gathering, while her establishment as respected community member created social foundation for continued professional service that territorial governance required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework that protected rather than exploited frontier populations whose development depended on rule of law and effective federal protection. The relationships that were developing with community members included romantic interest from several respectable men whose appreciation for her capabilities and character exceeded traditional gender expectations, while their recognition that professional competence and moral courage were more important than conventional feminine limitations created foundation for personal happiness and social integration that had seemed impossible during desperate circumstances that had originally brought her to territorial Arizona through deceptive mail-order correspondence that survival had required. The business opportunities that were available through federal contracts and community development included consulting services and law enforcement training that could provide additional income while also serving territorial needs for expanded professional capability and citizen education about legal rights and constitutional protection. While her unique background and demonstrated competence created market demand for services that conventional territorial resources couldn't provide without federal assistance and specialized training that her experience had developed. The future that was emerging through successful completion of federal mission and community integration exceeded anything personal circumstances had made possible when desperate survival had motivated mail-order bride deception, while recognition that individual capability and moral character were more important than social convention and gender expectations, created foundation for personal fulfillment and professional success that democratic society could provide when prejudice and systematic discrimination were overcome through demonstrated competence and community service that served constitutional values and territorial development. The courtship that developed between Marguerite and Dr. Philippe Beaulieu was conducted with mutual respect and intellectual equality that exceeded conventional frontier relationships. While his appreciation for her professional competence and personal character created foundation for partnership that could combine medical practice and law enforcement service for enhanced community welfare and territorial development that democratic institutions required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework that served population needs rather than individual advantage or systematic exploitation that organized crime had been providing. The proposal that was offered through careful consideration and honest discussion included recognition of professional obligations and continued federal service that territorial law enforcement required, while his willingness to support her career and share domestic responsibilities created foundation for marriage that could serve both personal happiness and community welfare through combined professional services that frontier development needed for providing citizen safety and medical care that isolated territories often lacked despite federal efforts to provide adequate resources and professional personnel. The wedding that was conducted with community celebration and federal recognition demonstrated social acceptance and professional respect that her transformation from rejected mail-order bride to respected law enforcement officer had earned through demonstrated competence and moral courage. While the ceremony included participation from citizens whose lives had been improved through elimination of criminal activity and establishment of effective law enforcement that democratic institutions provided when properly supported by professional competence and community cooperation. The partnership that was established through marriage included coordination of professional services and shared commitment to community welfare that territorial development required for providing citizen safety and medical care, while their combined capabilities created enhanced resources for addressing territorial challenges and providing foundation for family life that could serve both personal fulfillment and community service through continued professional excellence and moral leadership that democratic society required for successful territorial incorporation and constitutional government. The happiness that was achieved through honest partnership and mutual respect exceeded anything personal circumstances had suggested was possible when desperate survival had motivated deceptive mail-order correspondence, while recognition that professional competence and moral character could overcome social prejudice and gender discrimination created foundation for personal fulfillment and community service that democratic institutions could provide when individual capability was properly recognized and supported through social acceptance and professional opportunity. The anniversary that marked 1 year since Marguerite's arrival as rejected mail-order bride was celebrated as community recognition of transformation that had eliminated criminal activity while establishing effective law enforcement and medical services that territorial development required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework. While her integration into frontier society demonstrated that individual capability and moral character were more important than social convention and gender expectations for determining community contribution and personal worth that democratic institutions were designed to protect and encourage. The federal recognition that was provided through presidential commendation acknowledged professional service that had exceeded normal law enforcement achievements, while also establishing precedent for feminine participation in federal law enforcement that territorial needs required for providing adequate personnel and diverse capabilities that frontier challenges demanded, despite conventional limitations and social prejudices that had been preventing full utilization of available human resources for community service and constitutional protection. The community development that had been accomplished through elimination of criminal activity and establishment of effective law enforcement included economic growth and social progress that legitimate business and honest governance could provide when systematic corruption and organized crime were prevented through professional law enforcement and citizen cooperation, while the precedent that was established through successful federal intervention created framework for territorial governance that could protect constitutional rights and democratic institutions against future threats. The personal growth that had been achieved through professional success and community integration included emotional healing and social acceptance that had seemed impossible during desperate circumstances that had motivated original deception, while recognition that individual worth was determined by character and capability rather than social position and gender expectations, created foundation for personal fulfillment and continued service that democratic society required for maintaining constitutional government and citizen protection against systematic threats to territorial development. The legacy that was being established through continued law enforcement service and community leadership included legal precedents and social changes that could benefit future generations of women whose capabilities exceeded conventional expectations. While her example demonstrated that individual determination and professional competence could overcome social prejudice and systematic discrimination when supported by democratic institutions and community recognition of individual worth, regardless of gender or conventional limitations, that social prejudice had been imposing on feminine participation in essential community services. 20 years after that humiliating day when Marguerite Dubois had been rejected by 3 potential husbands in Esperanza Falls, the town square bore a bronze plaque commemorating the moment when their rejected mail-order bride had outdrawn Jacques Moreau and transformed herself from unwanted woman into legendary law enforcement officer whose service had eliminated organized crime while establishing federal protection for constitutional government throughout southwestern territories, where democratic institutions now flourished under rule of law rather than criminal control, that her courage and competence had systematically eliminated through professional excellence and moral leadership. The Law Enforcement Academy that had been established through federal funding and community support was graduating officers whose training included study of Marguerite's methods and principles as foundation for understanding that individual capability and moral character were more important than conventional expectations for determining professional competence and community contribution. While her example continued inspiring new generations of law enforcement personnel whose service could protect democratic institutions and constitutional government against systematic threats that required professional competence and citizen cooperation for successful prevention and elimination. The medical college that Dr. Philippe Beaulieu had founded with federal assistance was providing frontier territories with trained physicians and nurses whose education included emergency medical care and community health programs that his partnership with Marguerite had demonstrated were essential for territorial development and population welfare, while their combined professional legacy created foundation for comprehensive community services that democratic institutions required for providing citizen safety and social progress that legitimate governance could offer. The family that had grown to include 4 children represented hope for future generations who would grow up in territories where individual worth was determined by character and capability rather than gender expectations and social prejudice. While their education emphasized democratic values and constitutional principles that their parents' service had protected through professional excellence and community leadership that demonstrated how individual determination could overcome systematic discrimination and social limitation for achieving personal fulfillment and community service. The legend that had developed around Marguerite's transformation from rejected mail-order bride to respected federal marshal continued inspiring frontier women whose capabilities exceeded conventional expectations, while also demonstrating that democratic society could provide opportunities for individual achievement and community service regardless of gender or social position when professional competence and moral character were properly recognized and supported through institutional change and community acceptance that served constitutional values rather than traditional prejudice. As sunset painted the town square where she had first demonstrated that true strength came not from social acceptance, but from individual courage and professional competence, the bronze plaque reflected light that seemed to carry her story across territories where freedom flourished because one woman had possessed the determination to reveal capabilities that conventional wisdom claimed she couldn't possess. While her legacy continued proving that the most unwanted person could become exactly what their community needed most, when courage met opportunity and professional excellence overcame social prejudice in America's magnificent frontier where second chances were as limitless as the desert sky, and where love and partnership could transform individual achievement into community service that protected democratic institutions for generations whose freedom would be secured through precedents that her determination and sacrifice had established in territories where justice finally rode with those brave enough to draw faster than legend and strong enough to build futures worthy of the magnificent courage that transformed rejection into redemption.